the final stitch pulled taut, securing the last pearl to the cuff of a worn grey glove. Lady Eleanora Ainsworth held it up to the meagre light filtering through the grimy window of her bedchamber, the single pearl gleaming with a soft, defiant luster against the frayed fabric. It was a futile gesture, an attempt to mend the unmendable. Her family's fortune was as threadbare as the gloves, its once brilliant sheen long since tarnished by her father's gambling debts and her late mother's lavish tastes. Now there was nothing left but the crumbling stone of Ainsworth House, and a name that carried more weight in unpaid bills than it did in societal influence. The letter lay on her dressing table, its crisp parchment a stark contrast to the room's faded gentility. The Duke of Blackwood's seal, a severe-looking raven impressed in black wax, seemed to watch her with an unblinking, predatory eye. The offer within was as cold and hard as the wax itself, a marriage, not of affection, not even of polite acquaintance, but of pure, unadorned transaction. He required a duchess to manage his household, and, more importantly, to provide a mother for his young son and heir. In return, he would settle the Ainsworth debts in their entirety, securing the estate for her father, and providing her with a life of unparalleled luxury. Eleanora smoothed the grey glove over her slender hand. The terms had been laid out with brutal clarity by the Duke's solicitor, a man with a face like dried leather, and a voice that rustled with the sound of contracts. There would be no expectation of companionship, no pretense of a conventional union. She would be the Duchess of Blackwood in title, a chatelaine for his formidable estate, a governess for his child. Her rooms would be in the east wing, his were in the north. He would perform his husbandly duty only as required to secure a spare heir, and once that was accomplished, they would lead entirely separate lives under the same cavernous roof. A shiver, unrelated to the draught seeping through the window frame, traced a path down her spine. She had seen the Duke only once, years ago, at a London season, before tragedy had stolen him from society. Alastair Beaumont had been a striking figure, with hair the colour of jet, and eyes a startling glacial blue. There had been a warmth who circled their crumbling home like patient vultures. He did not have to live the life his signature would condemn her to. She would be a ghost in her own marriage, a decorative fixture in a house haunted by the memory of another woman. She would raise a child who was not hers, a boy who had lost his own mother and was now to be saddled with a stranger. Could she do it? Could she surrender all hope of love, of warmth, of a gentle hand in hers, for the sake of duty and financial security? The question was a mockery. There was no choice. The alternative was ruin, destitution, her father's disgrace, and the loss of the only home she had ever known. The single pearl on her glove seemed to offer a tiny pinprick of light in the gloom. It was a reminder of her own making, a small act of restoration. Perhaps that was all she could hope for, to find small ways to mend the broken things, to bring a little light into the encroaching darkness. She picked up her quill, the ink a deep, ominous black. Her hand was steady as she penned her acceptance. She would not weep or rail against her fate. She was an Ainsworth, and though their coffers were empty, their pride was not yet entirely spent. She would be the Duchess of Blackwood. She would be resilient. She would endure. She would walk into the winter of her life with her head held high, even if her heart felt as brittle as a frozen leaf. The letter, once sealed with her own family's crest, a rather hopeful-looking songbird, felt like a treaty of surrender. She gave it to the waiting footman without a word, watching from the window as the messenger galloped away, carrying her future with him down the muddy, rutted lane, leaving her behind in the suffocating quiet of a house that was no longer truly hers to save. The die was cast. She was to be the Winter Duchess, and a chill was already settling deep within her bones. 2 weeks later, the Duke's carriage arrived. It was not a grand affair meant to collect a blushing bride, but a functional, unadorned conveyance, lacquered in the same severe black as his seal, drawn by 4 perfectly matched geldings. Her maid, Agnes, a woman whose loyalty had been tested by years of dwindling wages, and who had nonetheless remained, packed Eleanora's few presentable gowns, where her presence was acknowledged with bows but no welcoming smiles. She was already in the Duke's sphere, a world of chilly precision and unspoken rules. They arrived at Blackwood Manor as dusk was bleeding into night, the sky a bruised purple. The estate was vast, a rolling expanse of ancient woodland and stark, manicured parkland. The house itself rose from the mist like a jagged peak, a Gothic masterpiece of granite and slate, its many windows either dark or emitting the barest flicker of candlelight. It was less a home than a fortress, built to withstand a siege. Perhaps, she thought, it had been a siege of grief. The massive oak doors swung open as the carriage drew to a halt, moved by unseen hands. A line of servants stood in the grand entrance hall, unnervingly still, their black and grey uniforms making them appear like solemn chess pieces arranged on the marble floor. At their head stood a butler of advanced years, his back as straight as a rod of iron, his face a mask of polite indifference. "Your Grace," he intoned, his voice devoid of warmth, "I am Hemlock, the butler. Welcome to Blackwood Manor." There was no sign of the Duke, no sign of her new stepson, just this silent, waiting phalanx of staff and the cavernous, echoing hall. The air was cold, carrying the scent of beeswax, old stone, and something else. Something like dried flowers, a lingering, melancholy perfume that seemed to rise from the very bones of the house. "Thank you, Hemlock," Eleonora said, her own voice sounding small and thin in the vast space. She stepped over the threshold, the heavy doors closing behind her with a boom that felt unnervingly final. She was inside the fortress now. "His Grace is in his study. He has requested that you be shown directly to your rooms. He will dine alone this evening," the butler stated, not as an apology, but as a simple fact. "Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, will attend you." A woman as severe and grey as the house itself stepped forward. Her eyes, the color of slate, swept over Eleonora in a single, comprehensive glance that missed nothing. From the mended gloves she still clutched in her hand. "Grace requires anything, you need only pull the cord," Mrs. Gable said, indicating a velvet rope by the mantelpiece. "Dinner will be served in your sitting room in 1 hour. Ale." With another curtsy, the housekeeper departed, leaving Eleonora alone in the opulent silence. She walked to the window and looked out into the impenetrable darkness. She was a duchess. She was the mistress of this vast, cold estate, and she had never felt more utterly alone in her life. This was not a marriage. It was an exile. The contract had been signed and sealed, and the first clause, a life of polite, Arctic separation, had already begun. She sank onto the edge of the stiff, brocaded chaise longue, the silence of the room pressing in on her, as heavy and suffocating as a shroud. Ale. The first week at Blackwood Manor passed in a haze of structured emptiness. Eleonora's days were governed by a silent, unyielding routine. Breakfast was served in her rooms. She would then walk the cavernous, silent corridors of the East Wing, or sit in the cavernous, silent library, a book lying unread in her lap. Luncheon was another solitary affair. Dinner was the same. She lived like a spectre in her own home, her presence acknowledged by the staff with quiet deference, but no interaction beyond the bare necessities of service. Ale. She saw her husband only twice in those first 7 days, and both encounters were as brief as they were chilling. The first was at the end of a long corridor. He was walking towards her, a sheaf of papers in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a wild moment, she thought he might not have seen her, so intent was his gaze. But as they drew level, his glacial blue eyes lifted and met hers. They were empty of any discernible emotion. "Ale, Your Grace," he said, his voice a low, formal rumble. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Ale, Your Grace," she replied, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Ale." And then he was past her, his long strides carrying him down the hall without a backward glance. The encounter could not have lasted more than 5 seconds, but it left her feeling chilled to the bone. He had looked at her, as if she were a piece of furniture, a new addition to the house that he noted but did not need to engage with. Alistair did not speak a single word to her. He ate with an austere, focused precision, his gaze fixed on his plate. Eleanor found it impossible to swallow. The food, exquisitely prepared, tasted of ash in her mouth. She watched him from across the vast expanse, studying the harsh lines of his face, the tension in his jaw, the utter absence of light in his eyes. He was a man locked away inside himself, and he had no intention of allowing anyone to find the key. When the meal was over, he rose, gave her the same curt nod as before, and left the room without a word. The silence he left behind was somehow heavier and more profound than the silence they had shared. It was during that first week that she first saw the boy, Julian. She glimpsed him from her window, a small, solitary figure in the vast browning expanse of the autumn lawns, accompanied by a stern-faced governess. He was a miniature version of his father, with the same jet-black hair, but he lacked the Duke's rigid posture. His small shoulders were slumped, his head bowed as he kicked listlessly at a fallen leaf. There was an aura of profound loneliness about him that resonated deeply with her own. He was the reason she was here, the small, sad boy she was meant to mother. Yet he was as distant as his father, kept from her by an invisible wall of household protocol and paternal decree. She learned from Agnes, who gathered whispers from the downstairs staff like a bird gathering threads for a nest, that the boy spent most of his time in the nursery wing with his governess, Miss Albright. He saw his father for precisely 1 hour each evening before bed, an appointment as formal and structured as any business meeting. The house itself was a labyrinth of grief. While the east wing, her wing, was impeccably maintained, other parts of the manor felt frozen in time. The grand ballroom was shrouded in dust covers, the chandeliers like giant sleeping spiders in muslin webs. And then there was the west wing. An entire section of the house was closed off, its connecting door locked and bolted. The staff never spoke of it, but their eyes would skirt past the door with a practiced avoidance. Agnes, in a hushed whisper, confirmed the rumor. It had been the late Duchess's wing. It had been sealed on the Duke's orders the day after her funeral 5 years ago, and had not been opened since. Solidified. On a Tuesday morning, a day of relentless, weeping grey rain, she had been staring of the library window, watching the water trace meandering paths down the glass, when she saw a break in the trees at the far end of the formal lawns. Through the mist, she could just make out the shape of a high stone wall, almost completely obscured by overgrown ivy, with a small, iron-wrought gate hanging askew on its hinges. It was a secret, forgotten place, a walled garden. Driven by an impulse she did not bother to question, she pulled on a heavy cloak and sturdy boots, ignoring the drizzle that immediately began to soak the fine wool. She crossed the wet grass, the hem of her dress growing dark and heavy with mud, and pushed open the groaning gate. The sight within made her gasp. It had once been a place of extraordinary beauty. She could see the ghost of it in the elegant layout of the stone paths, now almost completely consumed by weeds, and in the skeletons of climbing roses, their thorny, untamed arms reaching desperately for the sky. A crumbling stone bench sat beside a dry, moss-filled fountain, its cherubic centerpiece stained green with algae. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was a garden that had died of a broken heart. And in that moment of bleak recognition, Eleonora found her purpose. She would bring this garden back to life. It was a task no one had assigned her, a corner of this vast estate no one seemed to care about. It would be hers. She would tear out the weeds, prune the deadwood, and turn the soil. She would find the life that was still dormant here, waiting beneath the neglect. It was a quiet, solitary rebellion. If she could not mend the broken family within the house, she would start with the broken garden outside it. Perhaps, she thought, tugging at a thick, stubborn vine of ivy, by healing this small patch of earth, she could begin to heal a piece of herself. The work began the next day. Eleonora asked for nothing, simply appropriating a pair of thick gardening gloves and a set of rusted tools she found in a forgotten potting shed. At first, the gardeners, a taciturn crew led by a man named MacLeod, watched her with suspicion from afar. A duchess, on her knees in the mud, her fine skirt imagined him playing here on paths cleared of thorns, perhaps chasing a butterfly, or watching the fat bumblebees that would surely come if there were flowers. The thought spurred her on. The garden was not just for her, it was for him, a place of life and color, in a world that seemed to be rendered only in shades of gray. One afternoon, about a week into her project, she looked up from her work to see the boy standing at the gate, watching her. He was alone, having evidently slipped away from his governess. His dark eyes were wide, with a solemn curiosity. He did not speak, simply observed her as she knelt on the damp earth, carefully teasing out the roots of a particularly stubborn patch of groundsel from around the base of a rosebush. Eleonora's heart gave a little lurch. She knew a sudden movement or a forced pleasantry might scare him away. So she simply smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips, and continued with her work. She did not invite him in, nor did she speak to him. She just acknowledged his presence and allowed him his space. For several minutes he remained at the gate, a small, silent sentinel. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and was gone. But he came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time he would stand at the gate, watching. On the fourth day, he took a tentative step inside, his small boots making a soft crunch on the gravel she had just uncovered. He walked over to the dry fountain and traced the outline of the mossy cherub with a tiny finger. "He's supposed to have a fish," Julian said, his voice soft and high-pitched. It was the first time she had heard him speak. Eleonora stopped her work and turned to him, keeping her movements slow and calm. "Is he?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Mama said he spouted water from a fish's mouth. But the fish is gone." The mention of his mother hung in the air between them, a fragile, poignant thing. Eleonora felt a pang of sympathy so sharp it was almost painful. "Perhaps we can find it," she suggested gently. "It might be buried under all these leaves." Julian considered this for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on the fountain. Then he knelt down and began to push away the thick layer of damp, decaying leaves at the base of the statue. His small hands worked with a surprising hour, sometimes helping, sometimes just watching, a small, quiet shadow in the slowly reviving garden. It was a beginning, a tiny, fragile seed of connection planted in the neglected soil. Their silent companionship in the garden became a daily ritual. Julian would appear after his lessons, his presence no longer a surprise, but a quiet expectation. Miss Albright, the governess, would watch from a distance, her expression unreadable, but she did not interfere. Eleonora learned that Julian was a creature of observation. He rarely spoke, but he noticed everything. The way a ladybug crawled up a stem, the different shapes of the leaves she cleared away, the first brave buds of snowdrops pushing through the cold earth. She began to speak to him, not asking questions that demanded answers, but simply narrating her work, sharing her thoughts aloud. "This one, I think, is a peony. It will have big pink flowers in the summer." Or, "We must be careful here. I believe there are lily bulbs sleeping under the soil." She talked about the plants as if they were living beings with their own stories, and Julian listened with a rapt attention he likely never gave his formal lessons. One afternoon, as she was wrestling with a particularly gnarled and thorny rose cane, trying to prune away the dead wood without damaging the new growth, she felt a small tug on her sleeve. Julian was standing beside her, holding out a single, perfect white feather. "For your hat," he said, his gaze fixed on the ground. Eleonora's heart swelled. She took the feather with a reverence usually reserved for precious jewels. "Thank you, Julian. It's the most beautiful feather I've ever seen." She carefully tucked it into the band of her simple straw gardening hat. "How do I look?" He risked a glance up at her, and for the first time she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was a fleeting,